Congress will have a full plate when they return next month. House Speaker Paul Ryan was in Portland this week as he leads the charge for tax reform. Plus, lawmakers will face a budget fight and ongoing questions about the White House. As the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee and member of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Ron Wyden will have a front row seat for the debates.
This tax code is a broken, dysfunctional mess. I want to rewrite it, do it in a bipartisan way.
He joins us tonight before he returns to Washington, D.C. From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laurel Porter.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. Congress is back in session in 10 days, and lawmakers have a lot of work to do when they get back to D.C. Oregon Senator Ron Wyden has spent some of the last days of the congressional recess holding town halls, taking questions from Oregonians, and hearing what's important to them. Tonight on Straight Talk, I asked Wyden about those issues. We start with the president's call to send more troops to Afghanistan. Senator, welcome back to Straight Talk. It's nice to have you here, and we are in our new KGW newsroom. We're moving in this weekend, so you are our inaugural interview in the newsroom.
I'm happy to set a precedent.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
You know, there's so much going on. Even though Congress is on recess, there's no shortage of headlines in D.C. And I want to start with the president's announcement this week about Afghanistan. He did an about-face. He came into office saying he wanted to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, but on Monday he told the nation that he feels that there's an immense security threat that dictates that the U.S. remain involved, and he wants to send an unspecified number more troops. Do you support more troops and more money for a prolonged war in Afghanistan?
After 16 years of war there, I just don't see the case for this kind of involvement. And it seems to me what he's doing is doubling down on some bad ideas from several previous administrations. The George W. Bush administration seemed to have a strategy that never really laid out what winning was all about. And the Obama administration had a strategy that was sort of based around the idea, well, let's add some more troops. And to me, what it all adds up to is forever war, forever conflict. And I would support, I sit on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, I can't get into classified matters, I would support a continued role in terms of counter-terror efforts. But forever war, I'm not going to be signing up to support that kind of policy.
Because the president said that a hasty withdrawal or a withdrawal at all would leave a vacuum that may mean that ISIS or other terror groups would get a foothold there.
We should continue to work in the counter-terror area. Obviously, the Taliban, Pakistan, there are a number of these issues where I think we can play a constructive role in terms of isolating terrorist forces. But that's not where the president seems to want to end up. He kept talking about winning. I mean, you note the kind of language he used. It's the kind of language he uses generally. And we do want to win. But after 16 years of prolonged conflict, I don't see how the strategy adds up. And in fact, I think it's pretty hard to even identify a strategy. And I think our allies are also going to find it hard to sort out what the end game is.
He ratcheted up the tension with Pakistan, too, talking about how the U.S. can no longer be silent about Pakistan giving safe haven to terrorists. What does that mean for our future with Pakistan? He also mentioned India.
It certainly introduces two other countries that have a long history in the region. We need allies. There's no question about that. But you don't mobilize allies by sending such mixed messages. I mean, it wasn't very long ago when the president was back kind of arguing for 140-character policy ideas on Twitter and talking about how this was a lost cause and we ought to be out. So I will continue as a member of the Intelligence Committee to review any plans, but as of now, this looks, in my view, like some of the worst ideas from previous administrations sort of stapled together.
The wounds are still fresh from the violence at the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville and the death of Heather Heyer when a car plowed into a crowd of counter-protesters, and then President Trump's remarks afterwards that both sides were to blame. How much did that affect you personally?
The Wyden family knows a lot about Nazis. My dad and his family fled the Nazis. He got to come to our country, saw it as the freest and most open place on earth, and served in our army. We know something about Nazis in our families, and when you're talking about Nazis, you're not talking about something where there are two sides. They're just Nazis.
There's a growing call for a resolution of censure of the president for his response to the violence and seeming to defend white supremacists. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi's on board. Last I checked, there were at least 80 congressional members in the House that said they would sign on to that. Would you sign on to a resolution of censure?
I believe his actions with respect to Charlottesville were just plain wrong. I would support something like that. I have no illusions about this changing his behavior. What I would just hope is that he would see in the future that there are some of these issues where there are clear judgments with respect to right or wrong, and there were not many sides to this conflict.
Do you think that will dominate the discussion when you go back to Congress in a couple of weeks?
I think it certainly caused more skepticism about his ability to tackle big issues. I mean, look at the comments of Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Lindsey Graham, John McCain. This conflict with the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, just takes your breath away, because here they are 7 months into their administration. They don't have a signature legislative accomplishment. Mitch McConnell is their go-to person for getting legislation passed. And I can tell you already, I just regard it as legislative malpractice that they didn't come right in and pass a roads and bridges and infrastructure package.
Which the president promised.
President promised, he said he was a businessman, and it's just so doable. I mean, I wrote the Build America Bonds program during the Economic Recovery Act back in 2009. We sold $180 billion worth of Build America bonds. Oregon made extensive use on it. Many of the roads that your viewers traveled on this morning had improvements with Build America bonds, and yet he didn't do it.
I want to backtrack just a little bit to Mitch McConnell. The New York Times reported this week the relationship between President Trump and Senate Majority Leader McConnell has disintegrated, that they're locked into a Cold War. The Times says McConnell has privately expressed uncertainty that Mr. Trump will be able to salvage his administration after crises this summer, including his remarks about Charlottesville. How do you think that is going to affect the Senate and congressional business?
I'm going to be having another round of town hall meetings here shortly. I'll have had 64 town hall meetings this year. There's been unprecedented interest. I said I'm going to throw open the doors for unprecedented access, and I can tell you that Oregonians think there are serious issues out there, and they want serious answers. I mean, we've got a big health bill that's got a timestamp on it. It's called the Children's Health Insurance Bill. Well over 100,000 youngsters, in families that are walking on an economic tightrope, are depending on that bill to be renewed. It expires this year. So I'll let the Republicans sort out their own relationships, but I can tell you that Oregonians think there are serious challenges out there and they want serious answers.
I want to ask you a little bit more about President Trump. He gave a speech on Tuesday in Phoenix. There was some violence afterwards. The speech was described by many as angry and rambling, and then the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, whom you have sparred with at a number of hearings, said on television on some of the programs after that speech that he questioned Donald Trump's fitness for office. Where do you think President Trump's presidency is headed? What is your opinion on his fitness for office?
What's striking about the speech, as I understand it, is he had prepared remarks that focused on trying to walk back some of the polarizing rhetoric, focused on unity, and I'm sure this was the kind of thing that John Kelly probably had been involved in putting together. But he then went off the script, and knowing that there were extraordinary emotions and people, outside. It's almost as if the president welcomes bedlam, that when there is bedlam, he somehow feels that that will drive a lot of viewers and eyeballs to all of his comments and the conflicts he's creating. And I will just tell you, I hear Oregonians talking in a very different way. They want to see the government lower the decibel level and solve problems. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee. This tax code is a broken, dysfunctional mess. I want to rewrite it, do it in a bipartisan way. I hope the Republicans will give up a partisan approach and focus on particularly promoting innovative small businesses, because those are the businesses that are going to grow up to be the Nikes and Intels, but you're not going to do it with a bunch of wild rhetoric.
On the subject of tax reform, House Speaker Republican Paul Ryan has been in Oregon this week. He visited Intel, also is on a tour of what his office calls a tax reform business tour. You are the ranking member on the Finance Committee. Do you think you'll be able to find common ground with the Republicans on trying to come up with a tax reform plan?
Well, I've written bipartisan, plans. If any viewers are having trouble, they can see them at my website. They'll be asleep in a matter of minutes if they're trying to get some shut-eye. But the point is, if you're going to do bipartisan tax reform, the way Ronald Reagan did with a big group of Democrats in the 80s, you have to recognize that each one of these tax provisions has a whole set of powerful interests. So you've got to get people to say, look, we're going to build around principle. In 1986, Democrats said the tax code's been hijacked by the special interests. Republicans have said it's so inefficient that there's no certainty and predictability for private business to make investments. I happen to share both those views. But so far, the Republicans seem to mostly want to give the brakes out to the people at the top. And the economy is driven by the middle class. The consumer drives 70% of the American economy, and yet thus far the Republicans, one, they're looking at a partisan approach, and second, it's geared mostly to helping the 1% rather than the middle class who make the decisions that actually create good paying jobs.
You mentioned all your town halls. You've had 64 since the beginning of the year. You have 2 more this week in Seaside and Manzanita. You have held the most town halls of any senator. I think Senator Merkley's right behind you, so congratulations on having that #1 spot. What are Oregonians most concerned about when you hear from them at their town halls?
Well, so far this year, I think health care has dominated the town hall meetings, because the reality is, and I felt this way since I was director of the senior citizens, if you and your loved ones don't have their health, then everything else goes by the board. And I focused on my ideas, for example, on clamping down on prescription drug costs, which is very much on people's mind. And then up until recently, there's been great concern about Russia, and particularly the relationship between Vladimir Putin and various associates in the Trump campaign. I'm on the Intelligence Committee, and I've made it clear to Oregonians that I'm Oregon's guy on that investigation. I'm not going to let it get swept under the rug.
Let me just ask you about Russia. That DOJ investigation continues with the special counsel, Robert Mueller. There's the Senate Intelligence Committee. What can you tell us about those probes?
Well, Robert Mueller works on the criminal side. We work on the side of making judgments that you can talk about to the American people in a way that doesn't violate classification rules about how our democracy was hacked. Now, sometimes the lines blur. I've made a special focus on what I call the follow the money issues, and this goes back all the way to 2008, when the Trump family said much of their portfolio, and that was a time when it was hard to get money, involved Russian investments. So Jared Kushner came to the Intelligence Committee. It was in a closed session, but then he went out and read or made available his public statement, and he said things like, well, we don't rely on the Russians for our financing. As soon as I saw that, I said, hey, the word rely is a subjective word. He's not saying he has no business dealings with the Russians. He's not saying he's never had business dealings with the Russians. So I'm going to insist that Jared Kushner come before the Senate Intelligence Committee for an open hearing so I can ask those questions.
I read that the chair of the committee, Richard Burr, has said that he wants to wrap up your committee hearings by the end of the year. Do you think that's a good idea? Is that possible?
I believe an investigation goes where the facts lead, and you don't set, an arbitrary date. And particularly on these issues relating to follow the money, it can, and Bob Mueller has now got, according to the newspaper, something like 16 people, 14 of them with expertise on financial crimes. You take the time to do it right. I think the American people know that this speaks to, in effect, who the government represents. Does the government represent the millions of people in this country who vote for a president, pay taxes, work hard, or is a group running the executive branch looking out mostly for themselves?
When we come back, Senator Wyden talks about the president's pledge to build a wall. How will that affect budget discussions? Could it lead to a government shutdown? We also talk about net neutrality and all the wildfires burning in Oregon. We're back in 2 minutes.